My name is Eleanor Vance and I'm 67 years old. What I'm about to tell you began on the quietest, most devastating day of my life. The day we buried my husband, Richard. The wind was cold enough to make my hands shake even through my gloves. People spoke in soft whispers, a few sniffles here and there, the priest reading verses I barely heard. 40 years of marriage, gone in a single moment of silence and dirt. My phone vibrated in my purse. I remember it clearly, as if the world stopped spinning for that 1 second. A message. From an unknown number. I'm still alive. That's not me in the casket. My heart froze. The screen blurred as tears filled my eyes. I read it again and again. Still alive. Not me in the casket. I nearly dropped the phone. My fingers trembled so badly that the letters swam before me. For a moment I thought grief had broken my mind. I whispered to myself, this can't be real. He's gone. I saw his body. Richard, my husband, my companion, my other half, had been declared dead 3 days earlier after what my sons called a workshop explosion. They said a piece of machinery had malfunctioned, that it was quick, that he hadn't suffered. I wanted to believe them. But the message stared back at me, glowing cold against the gray cemetery light. Who are you? I typed, my hands shaking. If this is a joke, it's cruel. The reply came instantly. Don't ask questions. They're watching. Don't trust your sons. I looked up from the screen. My 2 boys, David and Simon, stood side by side at the casket, their arms folded, faces perfectly calm. Too calm. Their suits spotless, their expressions politely sorrowful, rehearsed. Something felt wrong. For a moment I searched for any flicker of genuine grief in them. The red eyes, the clenched jaw, the trembling lip that betrays love. But there was nothing. David checked his watch. Simon stared blankly into the hole in the ground. And I realized with a sudden chill that my sons looked more like businessmen at a transaction than sons saying goodbye to their father. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell me where you're listening from. If you received a message like that at your husband's funeral, who would you show it to first? Comment below. I tried to steady my breathing, pretending to adjust my scarf while slipping the phone back into my purse. If someone had seen that message, if my sons had seen it, what would they do? Mom, are you all right? David asked, his tone gentle but distant. I nodded quickly. Just dizzy, it's the cold. He smiled the way he always did when he didn't believe me. We'll get you home soon. That smile, polished, practiced, reminded me of the man he'd become. Once my boys had dirt under their fingernails from helping Richard fix old furniture in his shop. Now their hands were soft, manicured, used to holding fountain pens and phone screens instead of hammers. They had become the kind of men their father never was, and never wanted to be. When I close my eyes, I still see the beginning of it all. The years before ambition poisoned everything. Richard and I met when I was 23. He was a young carpenter in a small coastal town, his hands always rough, his laugh easy and bright. We built our first home from the scraps of a demolished barn. When it rained, we placed buckets under the leaks and laughed as we ran between them, trying to stay dry. We had little. No savings, no car, no fine clothes. But we had each other. When our first son, David, was born, Richard carved a cradle by hand. He worked late into the night, sanding every curve smooth. 2 years later came Simon, smaller, quieter, always following his big brother's shadow. Those were the years of true wealth. Simple meals, laughter on the porch, bedtime stories. The smell of sawdust on Richard's shirts and the sound of the ocean through the cracked window. But time changes everything. David from a young age wanted more. More than our modest house, more than his father's quiet workshop. He hated the creaking floorboards, the second-hand clothes, the tin roof that clattered in the rain. He studied business, left for the city, and never looked back. Simon followed him soon after. He studied law, said it was to help people. But I saw the same hunger in his eyes. The need to rise, to prove, to possess. When David married Lydia, a woman from the city with eyes that looked through people instead of at them, everything changed for good. The first time she visited, she stepped out of their car in heels that sank into the dirt of our driveway and said, "Oh, charming." That one word, coated in perfume and disdain, told me everything. David hovered behind her, embarrassed, as though our home, the very one built by his father's hands, was something to hide. At dinner she pushed the stew around her plate. Later she whispered to David when she thought I couldn't hear, Next time we should just take them to a restaurant. As the years passed, visits became rarer. Phone calls shorter. Money replaced affection. Polite pity replaced warmth. Richard once told me, sitting on the porch, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug, "Ellie, money's changed them. We're not enough anymore." I wanted to argue, but the truth was in his eyes. Our sons had built lives that no longer had space for us. They had outgrown their roots, or so they believed. And yet Richard loved them fiercely, even as they drifted. He still fixed their bikes when they visited, still sent hand-carved toys for birthdays his grandchildren barely remembered. I think in his heart he believed they'd come back one day. He didn't live long enough to see what they'd become. As the funeral ended, the pastor's voice faded beneath the sound of shovels. The weight of the dirt hitting the casket made my knees give out. I clung to my friend Doris, who whispered, "Be strong, Ellie." But strength meant nothing when the man who had been my anchor was now under the ground. And still, the phone's words echoed through my mind. "I'm still alive. That's not me in the casket. Don't trust your sons." On the ride home, I stared out the car window while David drove, humming softly to the radio, one hand steady on the wheel. Simon sat beside him, texting someone, his face lit by the glow of his phone. 2 sons. 2 strangers. 2 calm faces at a funeral that should have broken them. And deep inside, beneath the grief and disbelief, a small, cold seed of suspicion began to take root. The morning after the funeral, the house felt colder than it ever had before. Richard's slippers were still by the bed. His mug was on the kitchen table, a faint ring of coffee still inside. I touched it, half expecting it to be warm. It wasn't. I spent hours pacing the small living room, replaying that message in my head like a broken record. "I'm still alive. That's not me in the casket." No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was a cruel prank, something deep in my gut whispered it wasn't. When the sun began to set, I opened Richard's old desk drawer for the first time since he'd died. The scent of sawdust and varnish clung to everything. Letters, folded receipts, little sketches of furniture he never got around to building. I found an envelope marked insurance. Inside were papers with words I didn't fully understand. Numbers, signatures, and one phrase that made me freeze. Life insurance policy. Updated 2 months ago. $60,000 coverage. 2 months ago. Richard hadn't told me a word. We'd always shared every decision, every penny, every purchase, every fear. Why would he change that? Just as I sat down, the phone buzzed again. My heart jumped. Another message from that same unknown number. "Check the police report. You'll see what's missing." I didn't know whether to be terrified or grateful for whoever was guiding me. The next morning, I walked into the Spring Bay Police Department, my coat buttoned tight against the wind. A young officer at the front desk smiled kindly. "How can I help you, ma'am?" "My husband's accident," I said softly. "The workshop explosion. I'd like to see the report." He looked confused. "Explosion?" "Yes," I insisted. "Richard Vance. 2 days ago. He worked at the old carpentry shop on Main." He typed on his computer for a few moments, then frowned. "There's no record of an explosion, Mrs. Vance. No incident report, no fire department call, nothing." The room tilted. "That can't be right." "I'm sorry," he said. "Are you sure it was reported?" My voice cracked. "My sons told me it was." He gave me a pitying look that made me feel smaller than I ever had in my life. "If you want, I can file a formal inquiry. Maybe the hospital has something." The hospital. Of course. At Spring Bay Memorial, the receptionist asked for Richard's file. Her nails clicked against the keyboard, her tone too cheerful for the weight in my chest. "Here it is," she said. "Admitted Tuesday morning. Cause of emergency. Chemical exposure. Possible solvent inhalation." "Chemical exposure?" I repeated. She nodded. "Not explosion. No burns. His chart says respiratory distress and neurological symptoms consistent with methanol toxicity." My knees nearly buckled. Methanol. That wasn't from a machine accident. That was poison. I thanked her and walked out into the cold without remembering how my legs moved. Each breath burned as if my lungs were rejecting the truth forming in my mind. That night I called my sons. David answered on the first ring. "Mom, are you okay? You sound shaken." "Why did you tell me it was an explosion?" I asked. "Pause. Because that's what the doctor said." A chemical reaction may be the same thing. No. The hospital report says poisoning. Mom, he said, laughing softly, you must have misread it. You shouldn't go digging into these things. It'll only make you anxious. That tone, patronizing, polished, made my blood boil. I'd used it myself years ago on frightened patients who needed calming. It wasn't love. It was control. Then why didn't you report it to the police? I asked. Another pause. Mom, Dad's gone. Nothing's going to change that. Let's not make a circus out of it. And then before I could reply, the line went dead. The next morning I stood in the workshop. The smell of oil and sawdust still lingered, but the space was spotless. Too spotless. If there had been an explosion, there should have been scorch marks, debris, something. Instead, every surface gleamed as though freshly scrubbed. I ran my fingers over the table where Richard used to plane wood. The grain was smooth beneath my skin. That's when I noticed a faint line of scratches carved into the side, barely visible. Words, shaky but deliberate. Don't let them sell the house. I stepped back, breath catching in my throat. Who was them? That evening, David and Simon came to visit, dressed in black suits still crisp from the funeral. David carried a folder. Simon carried groceries. Lydia followed behind, her perfume filling the small kitchen like smoke. We need to talk, David began, sitting down without being asked. I could feel my pulse thudding in my temples. About what? About your future, Lydia said smoothly, crossing her legs. You shouldn't live here alone. The house is too much. You could move to Brookfield Residence. It's beautiful, safe, and full of people your age. A retirement home, I whispered. Simon smiled. It's not what you think, Mom. They have gardens, activities. I have a garden, I cut in. And activities? Lydia asked sweetly. Like, pacing the house, talking to yourself? David shot her a look but didn't correct her. He opened his folder. The truth is, Mom, the house isn't worth much anymore. Maybe $10,000 at best. If you sell it, I can add some money and we'll make sure you're comfortable. Comfortable. The same word he'd used for Richard's funeral. Something simple and comfortable. I'm not selling anything, I said. Mom, Simon sighed, you can't live in the past. Dad would want you taken care of. The moment he said Dad would want, something inside me snapped. You don't get to speak for him, I said quietly. Not after the lies. They exchanged a glance I couldn't quite read, half surprise, half irritation. Let's not start this, David murmured, standing up. You're upset. We'll come back tomorrow when you've rested. As they left, Lydia turned at the door and smiled faintly. Try to sleep, Mrs. Vance. You look tired. I locked the door behind them and pressed my back against it, shaking. The phone buzzed again in my pocket. A new message from the same number. You're right not to trust them. Check the bank account. The withdrawals aren't yours. I stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Whoever was sending these messages knew everything. About the house, about the insurance, about my sons. I looked toward Richard's photograph on the wall. His gentle eyes, the faint smile that had always promised safety. For the first time, that smile looked like a warning. Would you still believe your sons after a message like that? Tell me in the comments. I barely slept that night. The words from that message repeated in my mind over and over again. Check the bank account. The withdrawals aren't yours. By sunrise, I was already dressed, clutching Richard's worn leather folder. He had always been the one who handled our finances. Simple things, never more than our modest savings, enough for bills, groceries, and his workshop tools. But now I had to face the numbers myself, trembling hands and all. The bank manager, Mrs. Thompson, had known Richard and me for nearly 30 years. When she saw me walk in, her face softened with pity. Eleanor, my dear. I'm so sorry about Richard. He was a good man. Thank you, I whispered. I need to see our account activity from the last few months. I think there's been a mistake. She nodded and printed the statements. The sound of the printer echoed through the quiet office, each page another heartbeat of dread. When she handed them to me, I felt my breath catch. 3 large withdrawals. January, $1,000. February, $3,000. March, $4,000. $8,000 gone. $8,000 that I never touched, never approved. Who authorized these? I asked, my voice shaking. Mrs. Thompson frowned, flipping through her records. It's as Richard did. He signed for them here in person. She handed me the slips. Yes, the signature looked like his, but the curve of the R was wrong. Too sharp, too rushed. Richard's handwriting was always careful, patient. Did he come alone? I asked. She hesitated. Now that you mention it, no. I remember seeing David with him once. He said your husband was having trouble reading the fine print without his glasses. My blood ran cold. Richard never went anywhere without his glasses. I folded the papers slowly as though they were explosives, and thanked her with a trembling smile. When I reached the door, she added quietly, Eleanor, be careful. Back home, I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by documents, bank slips, insurance papers, old receipts, trying to stitch together a story that no one wanted me to see. The phone buzzed again. The insurance was their idea. They convinced Richard to raise it. Check the date of the policy. I flipped through the folder. The policy had been amended 6 months ago, and the new witness signature was Lydia's. A slow, sick realization crept through me. They'd used Richard's trust, his love, to set a trap. When I looked up, the photo of Richard above the mantel seemed to stare back at me. His smile now felt like a warning from beyond the grave. That evening, as rain drummed against the roof, I heard a car pull into the driveway. Headlights cut through the curtains. Moments later, the doorbell rang. David stood there in his polished shoes and city coat, a faint scent of cologne and impatience around him. Mom, you shouldn't be alone, he said, stepping in before I could answer. I brought some dinner. I noticed the way he scanned the room, his eyes pausing on the desk where I'd laid out the documents. What's all this? Just bills, I said quickly, sliding a few pages aside. He smiled thinly. Let me take care of that for you. You don't have to worry about anything. His tone was syrupy false. I'm not worried, I said. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. Mom, you've been under a lot of stress. You're imagining things again. Imagining what? This obsession with money. With Dad's accident. It's not healthy. Then he added carefully, Simon and I were talking, maybe you should let us handle the finances. Just until you're back to yourself. The room felt smaller. The air heavier. I could almost hear Richard's voice whispering, don't let them sell the house. I forced a smile. Maybe. We'll talk about it. He looked relieved as though he'd just closed a deal. Before leaving, he kissed my forehead and said, we'll come by tomorrow. Lydia's baking your favorite coffee cake. Coffee. The word made my stomach twist. That night I couldn't stay still. I paced the living room, phone in hand, waiting, hoping, for another message from that unknown number. When it finally buzzed, I nearly dropped it. You're not imagining it. They forged his signature. Check the desk again. Bottom drawer. I ran to Richard's desk and pulled open the bottom drawer. There, tucked beneath a pile of old sandpaper, was a small black notebook. His handwriting inside, shaky but unmistakable. March 2nd, David says I should increase the insurance. Says it's for Eleanor. I don't feel right about it. March 5th, Simon brought papers from Lydia. Says it's to update the business. I can't understand why they're in such a rush. March 8th, told Eleanor I'd check the wiring tomorrow. If anything happens to me, tell her to look at the papers. My vision blurred. He knew. He'd known something was wrong and tried to warn me in the only way he could. When dawn came, I sat by the window, clutching that notebook, watching the fog roll across the yard. For the first time since the funeral, I didn't cry. I was done being afraid. I looked at the final line Richard had written before his death. If you're reading this, Ellie, trust your heart. The truth always rises. I whispered, I will, Richard. I promise. The phone buzzed once more. Meet me tomorrow. 3 p.m. at the cafe on Main. I have what you need. When the morning came, it brought with it a silence that didn't feel like peace. It felt like waiting. The air in the house was thick, heavy with the kind of tension you can't see but you can feel crawling under your skin. Every creak of the floorboards made me turn my head. Every sound outside the window felt like a threat. I sat by the kitchen table staring at my phone. The message from last night was still there. Meet me tomorrow. 3 p.m. at the cafe on Main. I have what you need. Whoever had been texting me, whoever knew everything, wanted to meet face to face. I wasn't sure if I was walking into safety or a trap. Before I could think much longer, I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. I looked through the curtain. A black sedan. David, Simon, Lydia. They never came without a reason. Mom. David's voice was cheerful, almost rehearsed as he stepped inside without knocking. We thought we'd surprise you. Simon followed, holding a box from the bakery. Lydia trailed behind, her heels clicking softly against the floor. I didn't ask for company, I said, forcing a smile. David placed the box on the table. Lydia baked your favorite coffee cake. Lydia smiled sweetly. And I brought your favorite roast too. Fresh ground. The smell of coffee filled the room. It should have been comforting, but now it made my stomach twist. Something in me whispered, "Don't touch it." "Come on, Mom," Simon said. "You haven't been eating well. We're worried." "I'm fine," I replied. David sat down across from me. "You don't look fine." Then came that tone, the one that sounds gentle but cuts like glass. "Mom, the neighbors have been saying you're different. They said you've been talking to yourself." I blinked. "What?" Simon nodded. "And Doris, she told us you've been staying up all night. That you think Dad's still alive." My heart pounded. Doris never said that. Lydia leaned forward, voice soft and smooth as silk. "It's okay to be confused, Eleanor. Grief can make people see things. Believe things that aren't real. Grief. Confusion. They were trying to build a narrative. One where I was the problem. Not them." I folded my hands and looked at each of them. "What are you really here for?" David gave a practiced sigh. "Mom, we've spoken to a doctor. Dr. Holbrook, a specialist in geriatric care. He thinks you might be showing early signs of paranoia." "Paranoia," I repeated. "Because I asked questions?" "You've been calling hospitals, the police, the bank," Simon said. "You're making people uncomfortable." Lydia chimed in. "We just want to help before things get worse." Before things get worse. That's when I realized, they weren't here out of love. They were here to make me look insane. "What happens if I don't agree with this doctor?" I asked. David hesitated. "Then we'll have to do what's best for you legally. We've already started the paperwork for guardianship." Guardianship. The word hit me like a slap. It meant losing everything. My home, my freedom, my voice. "You're going to put your own mother in a home?" I whispered. David's jaw tightened. "It's for your safety." Simon added, "You could hurt yourself, Mom. You've been talking about poisoning, conspiracies. Dad's death was an accident." My hands were trembling, but not from fear. From rage. "An accident?" I said, standing. "Is that what you told the police?" They exchanged glances, startled. "There's no record of an explosion," I continued. "No report, no fire, no burns. Did you think I wouldn't find out?" Lydia's eyes narrowed. "You shouldn't be digging into things you don't understand. Like how the insurance policy was changed 2 months before his death?" I said. "Or how $8,000 disappeared from the account?" The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. For the first time I saw it, the flicker of panic in David's eyes. "Mom," Simon said carefully, "why don't we sit down? You're upset." I smiled. "You're right. Let's sit." I poured myself water from the pitcher and sat back down. They watched me. All three. Waiting. But when David reached for the coffee pot, I saw the faintest tremor in his hand. He filled my cup halfway. "Here," he said softly. I stared at the dark liquid, steam curling up from the rim. Something inside me screamed no. I slid the cup away. "I already had coffee," I said. His jaw tightened again. Lydia forced a smile. "Well, at least eat the cake." "I'll have it later." "You should eat it now, Eleanor," she insisted, her tone turning almost sharp. "It's best fresh." I met her gaze, holding it until she looked away. They stayed for another hour, circling the same conversation. How I needed help, how I wasn't safe alone, how they'd take care of me. When they finally left, the air in the house felt breathable again. I sank into the chair, every muscle trembling. The phone buzzed. "They'll try again tomorrow. Don't let them in. And don't eat or drink anything they bring." "Who are you?" I typed back. This time the reply came with a name. "My name is Mark Rowan. I'm a private investigator. Richard hired me 3 weeks before he died." He knew something was wrong. For a long time I just stared at those words. Richard hired him. He knew something was wrong. Tears welled in my eyes, but for the first time they weren't from grief. They were from fury, and the faint, glowing spark of hope. Mark sent one last message that night. Meet me tomorrow at 3 p.m. at the cafe on Main. I'll show you what Richard found. That night I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I sat in Richard's old chair by the window, the one where he used to read the newspaper, and whispered to the darkness. They think I'm losing my mind. But soon, they'll see exactly what kind of woman they're dealing with. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance. And for the first time in weeks I wasn't afraid of the storm. The cafe on Main Street hadn't changed in 20 years. Same chipped wooden tables, same old jukebox that hadn't worked since 2008, same smell of burnt coffee and cinnamon. But that afternoon it felt like the most dangerous place in the world. Every time the bell over the door chimed, I flinched. Every stranger who walked in looked like they might be watching me. At exactly 3 p.m., a man stepped through the door, tall, gray-haired, with a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. His presence was calm, but his eyes carried something heavy, knowledge. He walked straight to my table. Mrs. Vance. Yes. He nodded. I'm Mark Rowan. I'm sorry for your loss. And for what you've been through since. I studied his face. He wasn't what I expected. No trench coat or dark glasses, just a quiet man who looked like he'd seen too much truth in his lifetime. He sat across from me and placed the satchel on the table. Richard hired me 3 weeks before his death. He said he had a bad feeling about your sons. My breath caught. So he knew. Mark nodded slowly. He suspected. He didn't know the details yet, but he knew they were pressuring him about money. He said Lydia had become the voice behind most of their plans. He reached into his bag and took out a small black voice recorder. Everything you're about to hear was recorded in your house with Richard's permission. He wanted proof just in case. He pressed play. Richard's voice filled the air between us. That familiar warm tone that could calm me through any storm. Mark, I don't know what they're planning, but it doesn't feel right. David keeps talking about insurance. He says it's for Eleanor's security, but I think it's for something else. Lydia brought me papers. She said they're just policy updates, but the numbers don't make sense. My eyes blurred with tears. Hearing him again was like touching a ghost. The recording clicked, then continued. Simon asked about my routine this week. What time I drink my coffee, whether Eleanor joins me in the morning. He even asked about my medication. Why would he care about that? I gripped the edge of the table. The smell of coffee around me suddenly turned suffocating. I'm going to change my locks, Richard continued. And I'll keep my keys on me. If anything happens to me, Mark, promise me you'll tell Eleanor the truth. The recording stopped. I sat in silence, my hands trembling, my heart a war drum in my chest. Mark switched to another file. This one was captured in the kitchen 2 days later. I think you need to hear it. Static. Then David's voice, sharp and familiar. We can't wait any longer. He's starting to ask questions. Simon, relax. Lydia already mixed the solution. It'll look like a stroke. The doctors won't even test for it. David, and Mom. Simon, after Dad's gone she'll be too broken to notice anything. We'll handle her later. The sound of their laughter, my son's laughter, shattered something inside me that would never heal. I couldn't breathe. I pressed a shaking hand to my mouth, tears streaming down my face. By God, I whispered. They killed him. Mark's voice was gentle but steady. Yes. It was methanol, mixed into his morning coffee. I have proof of purchase from a hardware store under a fake name. I also have photos. He slid a few prints across the table. David standing outside a supply shop, a small metal can in his hand. Simon waiting in the car. The timestamp read March 6th, 3 days before Richard's collapse. I felt sick. The cafe seemed to tilt. Why didn't the police notice any of this? I asked. Because the death certificate was falsified, Mark said grimly. A doctor your son's bribed signed off on it. Heart failure following work-related accident. But there was no explosion. No burns. Only poison. I covered my face with my hands, the truth crashing over me in waves. When I could finally speak, my voice was hoarse. So they killed their father for money. And then tried to make me look insane so they could take the rest. Mark nodded. Yes. And there's one more thing. He played a third recording. Simon's voice. Once we get Dad's money, we'll need to take care of Mom too. Can't risk her poking around. David, how? Simon, same way. Only this time we make it look like suicide. The grieving widow who couldn't live without him. The house, the insurance, the savings, it all comes to us. The room spun. It wasn't just greed, it was a plan. Methodical, deliberate, rehearsed. My boys, my flesh and blood, had become strangers with murder in their hearts. Mark stopped the recording. I'm sorry you had to hear that. I wiped my tears, though my hands wouldn't stop shaking. What do we do now? We take this to the police, Mark said. Sergeant Donnelly is on night duty tonight, he's honest. He'll listen. But we have to move fast. I intercepted a call this morning between your sons and a judge named Mallory. They're trying to have you declared mentally unfit tomorrow. Tomorrow. 10 a.m., he confirmed. If that order goes through, they'll control everything, your money, your property, your freedom. We can't let that happen. I nodded slowly. Then we act tonight. Mark smiled faintly. That's what your husband would have said. We left the cafe through the back door as dusk settled over the town. For the first time in weeks, I felt something stronger than fear, purpose. By midnight, we'd copied every file, every document, every recording. Mark handed me a folder thick with evidence. Keep this close, he said. If anything happens, go straight to the police station and ask for Donnelly. I tucked it under my arm, feeling its weight. The weight of truth, of justice, of my husband's last fight. Outside, thunder rumbled again, rolling low across the hills. I thought of Richard, of the promise he'd once made when times were hard. No matter what happens, Ellie, the truth always rises. I whispered into the night, you were right, my love. It's rising now. The storm rolled in before sunrise, dark clouds pressing low over the town like a warning. Lightning cracked across the horizon as I stood at the window, clutching the folder Mark had given me, the evidence that could finally end this nightmare. Inside were the voice recordings, the forged signatures, the falsified insurance forms, and the receipts that tied my sons to Richard's murder. They wanted me to be silent. They wanted me to be gone. But by morning they would be the ones answering questions. At 5:47 a.m., Mark's car pulled into the driveway, headlights cutting through the mist. He stepped out, rain dripping from his coat, and gave me a steady nod. Ready? I nodded, though my heart was pounding. Let's finish it. We drove through the sleeping streets of Spring Bay, the kind of silence that only exists before dawn. Mark's eyes stayed fixed on the road. I called Sergeant Donnelly, he said. He's waiting at the station. Once he hears the recordings, he'll move immediately. But you need to be prepared, Eleanor. This won't be quiet. Your sons have influence and they'll try to twist the story. I looked out the window at the gray blur of trees passing by. I've already lost everything that mattered, I said. What's left for them to take? Mark didn't answer, but the flicker in his eyes told me he understood. We reached the police station just as the rain began to pour. Sergeant Donnelly was there, just as promised. A broad man in his 50s with weary eyes and a kind voice. He led us into a small office and shut the door. Mark set the recorder on the table and pressed play. Richard's voice filled the room. Then David's. Then Simon's. By the time the last recording ended, Donnelly's jaw was tight with anger. Good God, he muttered. Your sons did this? Yes, I whispered. And they plan to kill me next. He stood abruptly. You'll stay here. We're getting warrants. If what you've brought me checks out, and it will, by sunrise they'll be in custody. The next few hours felt like living inside a held breath. Rain beat against the windows. Officers came and went, phones rang, papers shuffled. Mark stayed beside me the entire time, silent, vigilant. At 8:23 a.m. Donnelly returned, a thin smile breaking the tension. Warrants are signed. They're moving now. Now? I asked, standing. He nodded. We've got units headed to David's house and Simon's apartment. Lydia too. By 9 a.m. it was done. Donnelly's phone buzzed and he put it on speaker. A voice crackled over the radio. Suspect 1 and 2 in custody. Found methanol canisters in the garage. Transfer receipts match the evidence. Lydia Cooper detained at residence. I sat back in my chair, hands covering my face. It was over. It was finally over. For a long moment none of us spoke. The storm outside had softened to a gentle rain, like the sky itself was exhaling relief. When I finally lifted my head, Mark was watching me with quiet respect. Richard would be proud, he said. I smiled weakly. He's the reason I'm still here. But the story didn't end there. The trial that followed was long and brutal. David's lawyers claimed I was delusional, that the recordings were fabricated. Simon tried to blame everything on Lydia, saying she had manipulated them both. Lydia cried in court, but her tears couldn't wash away the truth. When Donnelly presented the evidence, the forged signatures, the bank transactions, the methanol purchase, the courtroom went silent. And then came the final blow, Richard's notebook, the one hidden in his desk. His handwriting, his warnings, his final message to me. If you're reading this, Ellie, trust your heart. The truth always rises. I watched as the jury read that line. Some wiped tears. Others just stared at my sons like they were strangers. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty. David and Simon were sentenced to life without parole. Lydia received 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. As the guards led them away, David turned back toward me. For a moment I searched for my son, the boy who used to fall asleep on Richard's shoulder after fishing trips, the boy who once brought me wildflowers from the yard. But that boy was gone. Only greed remained in his eyes. That night when I returned home, I lit a candle in Richard's old workshop. The tools still hung neatly on the walls. The air smelled faintly of varnish and cedar. I placed the recorder and notebook on his workbench. "This was your fight," I whispered. "I just finished it." The rain had stopped, and through the cracked window I could hear birds returning to the trees. For the first time in months, the world felt alive again. Before I went to bed, I sent one last message to Mark. "Thank you for believing me when no one else did." He replied within minutes. "Justice isn't about revenge, Eleanor. It's about remembering who you are." I smiled, because that was exactly what this journey had done. It reminded me of who I truly was. Not a fragile widow, not a confused old woman, but someone strong enough to drag the truth into the light no matter how dark it was. 5 years have passed since that morning when the truth finally came into the light. 5 years since I sat in that courtroom, staring at the faces of my sons as the judge read the word, guilty. The storm that raged inside me for so long has quieted now, though sometimes when the wind moves through the trees at night, it still sounds like Richard's voice. Steady, patient, reminding me that peace isn't the absence of pain, but what grows after it. I live alone now in the same house where everything began. But it doesn't feel haunted anymore. Feels reclaimed. The old workshop at the back of the yard is no longer a place of loss. I turned it into something new, the Garden of Truth Foundation. Every morning I unlock the door and step into what used to be Richard's kingdom of tools and sawdust. Now it's filled with sunlight and the soft hum of hope. The wooden tables are lined with crafts made by women and men who, like me, survived betrayal at the hands of those they trusted most. There are shelves of handmade frames, vases, and carved signs that read things like, "Healing grows here. Justice is never too late." We started small, just 3 of us. A widow from 2 towns over who'd been swindled by her brother, a retired teacher whose son forged her pension checks, and me. Now there are dozens. Every week, we sit together in the garden behind the workshop, planting flowers where Richard's tool shed once stood. Roses for forgiveness, lilies for truth, and marigolds for endurance, because they bloom even in poor soil just like the human spirit. Sometimes reporters come, curious about the woman whose sons went to prison for killing their father. They expect bitterness. They expect vengeance. What they find instead is quiet strength. One of them asked me last month, "Do you ever visit them? Your sons?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "I visit the part of them that still lives here," I said, touching my chest. "The part that once loved us before greed took over. But the men they became, oh, those men made their choices." The truth is, forgiveness is not a gift you give to others. It's the freedom you give yourself. And yet, I never confuse forgiveness with forgetting. Every morning when I walk through the garden, I remember Richard's words from that last entry in his notebook. "If you're reading this, Ellie, trust your heart. The truth always rises." He was right. It rose like the sun, burning through the fog of lies until nothing could hide in its light. Mark still visits sometimes. He never changed much. Still quiet, still steady, still carrying too many stories in his eyes. He helps me with the foundation's paperwork, sometimes volunteers in the workshop. People like to assume we're together, but it's not like that. We share something different, respect built from shared survival. A kind of friendship that doesn't need explaining. Do you ever think about leaving this place? He asked me once. Sometimes, I said, looking toward the garden. But then I remember how much has bloomed here. This is where I lost everything, and where I found myself again. He smiled softly. Then it's exactly where you're meant to be. Last month, a young woman named Clara joined the program. She came with shaking hands and eyes that wouldn't meet mine. Her brother had stolen her inheritance and left her penniless. I don't even know where to start, she whispered. I took her hand and said the same words Mark once told me. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about remembering who you are. Now she carves small wooden birds at Richard's old workbench. Each one different, imperfect, beautiful. She sells them online, and every sale makes her smile a little more like someone who's learning to breathe again. Watching her, I realized this is what Richard wanted me to do all along. To turn grief into growth. To turn truth into something that gives life instead of taking it. At sunset, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees. The roses sway gently, the lilies bow their heads, and the marigolds glow gold in the fading light. Sometimes I still feel Richard beside me, his laughter in the wind, his steady hand on mine. And I whisper, "We did it, my love. The truth rose just like you said it would." The air smells of rain and earth and new beginnings. And for the first time in a very long time I feel something I thought I'd never feel again. Peace. Before we end, I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, if the people you loved most betrayed you, would you seek revenge or would you rebuild your life from the ashes? Tell me in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine. Because here in this garden, every story blooms from truth.